and that is, how does this change over time? What we've been stressing, unmistakably, is the importance of transportation costs in the development of cities, in where people live, where production takes place, where exchange takes place. Transportation costs and density are the two key words. But now we want to look at the 20th century. The first thing we see is that there is a tremendous decentralization in the end of the 20th century as we go into the 21st century. Of all the metropolitan people living in metropolitan areas, central city and suburbs and metro areas, you have 161 towns and cities in the greater Boston metro area. There was about 2/3 lived in the core city from 1910 to 1940. And it began to decline right after World War II as people moved to the suburbs, as manufacturing moved to the suburbs, and along with people and manufacturing, lots of services from real estate to department stores to supermarkets to everything else, schools, recreation. By 1960, only half the people who lived in metro areas lived in the central city. 40 years later, in the 2000 census, it's down to roughly 1/3. So we've gone from 2/3 living in the central city to 1/3 living in the central city. And economists and others tend to talk about centripetal forces, ones that move you toward the center, versus centrifugal forces that move you out to the sides. And there are both centripetal and centrifugal forces in operation. By 2010, certainly by 2020 census, I expect to see some of this reverse, particularly as us who are getting older in the room, who've sent their kids off to school, get letters once in a while or email now, but are ready to trade in that 1-acre home in the suburbs for what might be easier living on the 15th floor of a house in the central city. A centripetal force pulling us back in, our age. So let's take a look at the traditional model that we've just been seeing in a slightly different schema. Here is where we have a market in which transportation costs are still critical. Bringing product to market, getting people to your product. Labor costs are relatively low, and site costs, how much it costs to actually develop the site on which your land is very small. And in this case, where transportation costs dominate, just as we've seen in Professor Williams' lectures here, you're going to focus on concentrating the production and distribution as close to the central city as possible. You'll be in the central city. So when we look, for example, at Boston and Cambridge, you'll find out that if, I may have mentioned this last week, if you go across the BU Bridge from Boston to Cambridge, you'll see a huge building in front of you, which used to be a Ford plant where the Model T was built. And all those triple deckers you see in that Cambridgeport area house the workers who walk to work to produce those cars there. It was highly concentrated right there. And those cars, those Model Ts, which were built all across the country, Ford sent parts out and they were assembled all over the country, nearer their market. So you have that centralization. But what happens is transportation costs decline, labor costs begin to rise, site costs become a little bit more important and more expensive in the central city because you have financial services and others located in the central city, making it very expensive for manufacturers to be there. You start moving away from the central city. You start getting the suburbanization of industrialization. And this is also driven by technology, because what is found is that the kind of factory that Henry Ford had on the banks of the Charles was not a very efficient way of producing cars. 5-story buildings where you have to move parts vertically on tons of elevators is a very expensive way to build an automobile. The plant that I worked in covered, I think, 14 acres, and it was 1 story. Well, where do you find cheaper land where you can spread out the suburbs? And so you have industry already moving to the suburbs in order to take advantage of cheaper land as insurance companies and banks, lawyers, accountants take over the central city. And you begin to get people moving out with them. And so we move from the central city to the suburbs. That's what we saw in that period of time of decentralization after World War II. Again, driven by costs, but in this case, transportation costs becoming a little bit lower, site costs going up. And then we take a look at what might be the future. The future of Thomas Friedman's "The world is flat." Transportation costs approach zero. We move effortlessly across land, nearly at the speed of sound, in Boeing 747s and Airbus A330s. And what is more, we can communicate easily, maybe almost freely, and thus coordinate far-flung operations, making it possible to take advantage of cheap transportation. If we had cheap transportation without cheap communications, it wouldn't work very well. Because how do you communicate? How do you coordinate? But if you have the real technological revolution, not silicon, but transportation and communications, transportation costs, communication costs drop dramatically. Then what becomes important? Well, certainly site costs, but now labor costs become critical. And what that means is in the 21st century city, production can take place almost anywhere because you're not constrained by transportation and communication costs. You're constrained to some extent by site costs, but you're really constrained by labor costs. Now you're trying to go through your calculus as to where should I locate? Central city, suburbs, India, China. The fact that we move from the 19th century where transportation costs dominated the profit calculus to a time by the 21st century where labor costs dominate, if for no other reason that transportation costs, in a sense, have been licked. Where you locate is going to have to do with what your labor costs are. Now, that doesn't mean just wages, because you need wages tied to real skills. And therefore, the real question is, do you have the real cost of labor measured in skill equivalents or in terms of human capital? Where do you move that? Right? If in China and India we still had everybody with a 4th grade education, it would be unlikely that we'd be able to move so many operations to those countries. But that's no longer true. We have incredibly skilled engineers, incredibly skilled scientists, incredibly skilled communicators in those countries. I saw them in my trips to China just last year, trips elsewhere. And therefore, we're moving to a world in which locating near the central city, locating in the suburbs, or located in Shanghai, turn not on transportation costs anymore, but turn on these very, very different factors. So, let's just look at this very quickly and take a break. How would this show up? Part of it will be showing up just looking at imports as a share of gross domestic product. Right? In 1929, imports were equivalent to 5.7% of gross domestic product. Or put another way, for every $100 of gross domestic product, we imported $5.70 worth of goods. Interestingly, after 1929, that falls. We become less dependent on imports. The first was because of the Great Depression. The second was just when we were getting over the Great Depression, we went into World War II, and we weren't importing a lot during World War II from Germany or Japan. Right? It's not until 1969, 24 years after the end of World War II, and 40 years after the beginning of the Great Depression, that imports become the same share of GDP as they were in 1929. To me, that's rather staggering. But it is interesting to know that in 1969 we land a man on the moon. In 1969 we have the first massive use of silicon technology in the guidance systems in those rockets. And most importantly, in 1969, we have the first delivery of the Boeing 747, the large commercial jet, not just to American Airlines, but to freight companies who could now move freight nearly in large quantities nearly at the speed of sound. Look what happens given that technological revolution in communications and technology. The share of imports rises from about 5.7% to about 11% by 79. It then fluctuates, and then beginning in the early 1990s, it takes off again, so that by 2004, it's up to 15%, or almost 3 times what it was in 1969. That is the transportation revolution, but if you think about it in terms of the location of production and where the great cities are going to be, they're in China, they're in India, they're in Brazil, in places where you still have less expensive labor that you can take advantage of, less expensive land that you can take advantage of, given that you don't have to worry as much about transportation costs. So all the work of Alonso and all those guys who built all their models around transportation costs were right for the 19th century. They were right for much of the 20th century, but we need a new economics. We need a new model to explain location in the 21st century, and that new model has a lot to do with who has the human capital. Who has the way of being able to pull together the resource that is now the most expensive. Not transportation. It's human capital, it's brain power. And that's why Boston continues to be a powerful center as an urban place to live. Let's just look at it in terms of where cities were. Here's 1969. Of the 20 cities that we were looking at in our textbook, The Urban Experience, Detroit, as late as 1969, imports are still only 5.7% of GDP, same as in 1929, Detroit had the highest median household income as an indicator of how popular and how important that city was. At the other end was Austin, with median household income literally half of what Detroit had. And also down there was Raleigh. Poor Raleigh. Jacksonville. Tacoma, Washington. Tucson, Arizona. That's 1969. Most of us in the room, right? We're adults in this time. This is not ancient history. This is just a moment away in history. And then we look out toward what I call the movement toward the post-industrial society. What happened to the percentage change in median household income over this time in these 20 cities? Number 1 was Austin, more than doubles. Raleigh, 80% up. San Francisco, 60% up. Detroit, well, it's up by about 4%. And Buffalo is down by 4%. That is, the real median household income was actually lower in 1999 than it was in 1969. As a